Good morning, brothers and sisters. Let me ask you a question that might shake you a little. What if the very breakthrough you've been crying out for, the healing you've been waiting on, the direction you've been begging God to give, has been written in Scripture all along, but you just never saw it? What if there is a chapter in the Bible that holds the key to unlocking your healing, your clarity, your financial release, and your purpose? But it's been hidden from you, not because God didn't want you to know it, but because the enemy didn't want you to apply it. We read the Psalms for comfort. We quote Proverbs for wisdom. We memorize John 3:16 for salvation. But there's a chapter many never talk about. A chapter that doesn't just tell you what God can do, but tells you exactly what you must do to activate heaven's response in your life. Have you ever fasted and felt like nothing happened? Have you ever prayed and it felt like the heavens were silent? Maybe, just maybe, it's because we've been missing the blueprint. In this video, I'm going to take you deep into a chapter that most have overlooked. I'm going to show you why it's been hidden, what's really inside, and how it can transform your life starting today. Stay with me, and by the end, I promise, your spirit will be awakened to a truth that's been waiting to set you free. If this message blesses you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Let's uncover what's been hidden together. Shout it aloud. Do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion, and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. The chapter opens with a command from God to confront the people. Not the outsiders, not the pagans, but his own. They were doing all the right things externally. They fasted, prayed, sought his presence daily, and even claimed to delight in his laws. On the surface, it looked like a spiritual revival, but God was not impressed. There's a painful truth in this. You can look holy and still be far from God. The people assumed their religious acts would gain them favor. They were faithful in ceremonies, but faithless in character. They lifted their hands in worship, but wouldn't lift a finger to help the oppressed. That's the disconnect. That's why God called it rebellion, not because they weren't worshiping, but because they were worshiping while ignoring what he truly required. In today's terms, it's easy to fall into the same trap. Many go to church every Sunday, attend weekly Bible studies, and even lead ministries. But those same people may hold grudges, speak with arrogance, or turn a blind eye to injustice. God is not moved by your church attendance if your heart is absent from his agenda. A man once told a story of a business leader in his church who donated generously to missions, but underpaid his employees and treated them with disrespect. When confronted, he said, "I give to the Lord. That's what matters." According to Isaiah 58, that's not what God is looking for. He wants integrity in private and justice in public. He wants a life that reflects his values, not just lips that recite his name. God's rebuke in verse 2 is piercing, as if they were a nation that does what is right. They weren't righteous, but they acted like they were. This kind of religious performance is dangerous because it creates a false sense of security. It's easier to act spiritual than to become spiritual, but God looks at the fruit, not the foliage. He wants transformation, not tradition. The reason this passage feels hidden is because it exposes hypocrisy. It dismantles the illusion that God can be manipulated by ritual. He cannot. He is not a genie. He is a just king. If your spirituality doesn't impact how you treat others, it is not from the Spirit of God. This chapter calls believers to examine not just what they do in worship, but how they live afterward. God is not looking for noise. He's looking for change, and that begins when religious activity is replaced by relational obedience. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed? The people were frustrated. They did what they were taught, fasted, prayed, mourned. But God remained silent. They felt ignored. In their eyes, they had performed the ritual correctly, so where was their reward? God responds with a sobering reality. He saw their fasting, but he also saw their fighting, their exploitation, their selfishness. He wasn't moved by their ritual because their hearts remained hard. Fasting is not about missing meals, it's about breaking chains. It is a spiritual discipline meant to humble the flesh and elevate the spirit. But these people fasted for themselves. They used fasting as leverage, as if abstaining from food would pressure God into answering their prayers. This is not the purpose of a fast. A true fast is not transactional, it's transformational. God said, "You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high." That statement reveals a critical principle. Posture matters more than practice. The external act must be matched by internal alignment. If your fast does not lead to humility, compassion, and justice, then it's not a fast God accepts. In modern culture, fasting has been turned into a spiritual currency. People say, "I'm fasting for a job, for a spouse, for a promotion." But that mindset treats God like a vending machine. Fasting was never designed to get you something. It was designed to make you someone more obedient, more aware, more surrendered. A woman once shared how she fasted for 21 days, asking God to reconcile her marriage. During the fast, she refused to speak to her husband. She remained bitter and emotionally distant. In her mind, she was doing the spiritual work, but in reality, she was neglecting the very change her marriage needed. She didn't need a miracle, she needed humility. God's definition of fasting is not passive hunger but active transformation. He's not looking for empty stomachs but broken hearts. He's not impressed by how long you can go without food. He's interested in how far you'll go to obey his voice. This truth has been hidden because it's easier to perform than to change. It's easier to check a box than to confront your attitude, but God sees through the performance. He listens to the heart, not just the hunger. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke? God interrupts the conversation and redefines what fasting truly means in his kingdom. While the people were focused on rituals and religious exercises, God was focused on people, on pain, on oppression, on bondage. He reveals that the kind of fast he chooses is not centered on self-denial, but on societal transformation. God links fasting with justice. This is radical. It means a fast is not complete until it affects your relationship with the world around you. It is not simply vertical, between you and God, but horizontal, between you and others. True fasting touches the poor, the oppressed, the voiceless. God wants a fast that breaks chains, not just spiritual ones, but financial chains, emotional chains, systemic chains. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because it challenges the idea that spirituality can be separated from social responsibility. Some prefer to pray about injustice rather than act against it. But God says, "Loose the chains." That's an active command. That means standing up when others are silent. That means using your influence to lift someone else's burden. That means asking hard questions about inequality, prejudice, and exploitation. God continues, "Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter?" This is not figurative language. He's speaking literally. Take the bread you're withholding during your fast and give it to someone who hasn't eaten in days. If your fasting only results in you being hungry while someone else remains hungry too, it's not a godly fast. A businessman once shared how he was fasting for clarity on a business deal. On the third day of his fast, he saw a man digging through a dumpster for food. Convicted, he bought the man a meal and sat with him. During their conversation, The man mentioned a local non-profit that was struggling to help the homeless due to lack of funds. That conversation redirected the businessman's fast. Instead of just seeking clarity for his business, he began asking how his business could be part of the solution. That is the kind of fast God is talking about. God also says, when you see the naked, clothe them, and do not turn away from your own flesh and blood. This speaks of empathy. Compassion begins when we see ourselves in the suffering of others. Fasting, in its truest form, should awaken that compassion. It should make you more human, more humble, more helpful. Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. There is a powerful then in verse 8. God reveals the direct consequence of living out the kind of fast he desires. When we align with his heart for justice and compassion, restoration begins, not just for others, but for ourselves. The light breaking forth like the dawn is a picture of hope, clarity, and breakthrough. Many people feel stuck in spiritual darkness, unsure why they can't hear from God, why their prayers seem unanswered. God answers that question here. If you want to see breakthrough, step into obedience. If you want the light to break through, break the yokes that keep others bound. Healing will quickly appear. That's not just physical healing. It's emotional healing, relational healing, financial healing. Some wounds are not caused by sickness, but by disobedience. When obedience returns, healing flows. There's a connection between how we treat others and how God responds to us. Not because he withholds blessing out of spite, but because injustice disrupts the flow of his presence. Verse 9 continues, "Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, 'Here am I.'" The gap between heaven and your situation begins to close when you live the life God honors. God becomes near, responsive, and present. Many are crying out for God, but not living in alignment with his desires. But when you start living for what God cares about, he shows up. When you give your voice to the voiceless, God gives his voice to your prayers. A pastor once shared about a time when his church shifted from internal programs to community outreach. They began feeding the homeless, helping single mothers, and supporting local schools. He said the atmosphere in the church changed. People began experiencing personal miracles, healing testimonies, and financial breakthroughs. Why? Because the church moved from religious performance to righteous action. That's the restoration Isaiah 58 promises. There's something supernatural about obedience. It doesn't just change the circumstances. It changes you. It makes you sensitive to God's voice. It clears the fog of confusion. It brings clarity, strength, and renewal. Obedience aligns your life with divine rhythm. It breaks the delay and accelerates destiny. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. God doesn't just want you to experience personal healing. He wants you to be a healer. Fasting was never meant to be a solitary exercise that ends with a personal blessing. It was meant to turn ordinary people into restorers of what's been broken for generations. This verse speaks of generational impact. Ancient ruins and age-old foundations suggest the kind of damage that spans decades or even centuries. There are families where bitterness has been passed down like inheritance. Neighborhoods that have been abandoned by hope, communities fractured by racism, violence, and economic oppression. God says, if you fast the way I want you to fast, you will be part of rebuilding what's been destroyed. God gives titles to those who walk this path: repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. These aren't symbolic labels, they're identities. You become someone who mends the division between people, between generations, between heaven and earth. This is not about being famous. It's about being faithful. It's not about platforms. It's about purpose. Think of a woman who fasts and prays not for herself, but for her estranged children to come home. Then she opens her heart to apologize, forgive, and restore. That woman becomes a restorer, or a man who uses his business profits to fund rehabilitation centers for former addicts. He becomes a repairer of lives. These are not grand gestures in the world's eyes, but in God's kingdom they shake eternity. One of the most broken walls in today's world is between generations. The young blame the old reject the young. Fasting God's way brings humility and healing that tears down walls of misunderstanding and builds bridges of wisdom. When hearts are humble, age becomes an asset, not a battlefield. God's plan for restoration doesn't involve waiting on a system. It involves becoming the system. You don't need to be elected to bring change. You need to be yielded. God will use anyone who is willing to trade ritual for righteousness. Your willingness to repair one relationship, reconcile one broken friendship, restore one wounded community, can become the seed of a national revival. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, this verse shifts the focus from fasting to the Sabbath, but the theme remains the same. Obedience is the key to God's blessing. The Sabbath was never just a religious rule. It was a relational rhythm between God and his people. Honoring the Sabbath was a declaration, God is my source, not my labor. Breaking the Sabbath wasn't just about working on the wrong day. It was about trusting in yourself instead of trusting in God. It's a heart issue. When we push ourselves to the edge without rest, it often reveals we believe everything depends on us. But when you honor the Sabbath, you are saying, I trust God to take care of what I can't finish. The Sabbath is also a test of our delight. The verse continues, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable. God isn't asking for duty. He's asking for desire. He doesn't want people to observe the Sabbath with grumbling and obligation. He wants his people to delight in it. When your heart delights in God more than in productivity, promotion, or profit, you're living in alignment with the kingdom. A family once made a commitment to unplug from all digital devices every Sunday. No phones, no TV, no work, just worship, fellowship, and rest. At first, it felt like a sacrifice, but over time they found their home was filled with more peace, more laughter, more connection. Their children began to love the time together. What started as a discipline became a delight. That's the power of honoring the Sabbath. God's mention of not doing as you please isn't about restriction. It's about redirection. It reminds us that the Sabbath is sacred. It's a day where self-centered living takes a backseat and God-centered purpose comes forward. It's a divine invitation to pause and remember who you are and whose you are. This chapter reminds us that the way we handle time reveals our priorities. And when God is our priority, everything else begins to align. Rest becomes worship. Worship becomes obedience. And obedience releases blessing. Then you will find your joy in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land, and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. When your life becomes centered on God's desires, when your fasting is real, your motives are pure, and your Sabbath is honored, something begins to shift inside of you. You no longer pursue God for what he can give. You start delighting in who he is. That's when joy is no longer circumstantial. It becomes spiritual. You will find your joy in the Lord. He says, not in money, not in people, not in success, but in him. There is a difference between delighting in God's blessings and delighting in God himself. The former can make you comfortable. The latter will make you powerful. When you delight in him, everything that once overwhelmed you begins to lose its hold. Anxiety loses ground, fear retreats. You rise above the noise of life because your joy is now rooted in something unshakable. God doesn't just promise joy, he promises elevation. I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land. This is a picture of divine promotion. When others are walking, you're soaring. When others are confused, you have clarity. When others are trapped in cycles, you are advancing with purpose. This is not man-made success, it's heaven-backed authority. This type of authority can't be faked. It can't be manufactured with charisma or credentials. It only comes from communion. Think of Joseph in prison, forgotten by men but remembered by God. When his heart stayed aligned with heaven, he was lifted out of a pit into the palace. He didn't just rise, he ruled. He was riding in triumph over land that once enslaved him. The final part of the verse is deeply prophetic, to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. This is a reference to covenant. Jacob's inheritance was not just land, it was legacy. It was the promise God made that his descendants would be blessed, favored, and used to bless nations. When God mentions this, he's reminding us that obedience doesn't just impact you, it unlocks generational promises. Many people today are chasing platforms, but God is offering inheritance. There's a difference. Platforms are temporary. Inheritance is eternal. When you align your life with Isaiah 58, when you live to please him, love others, and honor his presence, you step into a realm of spiritual authority that no man can give and no devil can steal. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. These are not ordinary words. They carry divine finality. God doesn't waste breath. When he speaks, it becomes law. Heaven and earth may pass away, but his word remains. That's why this final sentence in Isaiah 58 is so critical. It seals the entire chapter with a royal decree. When God says something, it's not a suggestion. It's a settled matter. The phrase, "the mouth of the Lord has spoken," is a legal term in spiritual realms. It means no demon can overrule it, no circumstance can reverse it, and no human opinion can dilute it. It's done. There are moments in life when we need to cling to what God has spoken more than what we see, because what we see might look like lack, but what God said is abundance. What we feel might be rejection, but what God said is acceptance. When the mouth of the Lord speaks, it silences every other voicing, including your fears, your doubts, and even your past. This declaration isn't just poetic, it's prophetic. It means that everything promised in the chapter is guaranteed if the conditions are met. If you loose the chains, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, honor the Sabbath, and delight in God, then you will be healed, guided, restored, elevated, and satisfied. Not maybe, not if the economy aligns, not if people approve, you will, because he said it. A woman once wrestled with whether God could really heal her marriage. She'd fasted before, but with frustration and bitterness. Then she read Isaiah 58 and decided to follow God's blueprint. She humbled herself, reached out to her husband, and began to pray blessings over him. Months passed. Nothing changed outwardly, but she kept going. Then one morning he came to her with tears and said, "I don't know what's happening, but I want to start over." That's what happens when God's word is obeyed. His spoken promise cannot return void. When the mouth of the Lord speaks, it is not just truth, it is life. And when life from God enters your spirit, it revives dead dreams, renews lost hope, and releases heaven's authority on earth.